Thanks for tuning into A Better World. I'm your host, Luis Acevedo, and I apologize for being gone for the past couple days. I did record audio for the last episode I did. However, for whatever reason, the audio froze on my Odyssey software, so nothing was recording after like 19 seconds, but the video was still recording. And I didn't know it because I had my computer popped up on other windows. So once I finished with the episode, I found out that, oh, okay, the whole thing for audio stopped at 19 seconds. So for those of you who've seen the YouTube video but were wondering where the podcast, the audio version was, it froze. It just wasn't there. And I was too lazy to convert the video into audio. However, I will do that eventually. I know I need to do that so that way I can have it on the audio as well, because I know a lot of people listen to the audio. And anyway, what I want to talk about today is something that has been jogging through my mind the past couple of days, and that is the separation of powers. And is it coincidental that it is separated into three branches, like the Trinity, if you will? And I'm not comparing our system to God in any way, but if we look at the Bible, it does say in Romans, I can't remember the exact verse, but essentially the authority of the land, governments, are how God keeps his law on earth, if I'm not misquoting that. And so it would not seem to me coincidental that the framers went into creating our government and democracy, republic rather, that we have now, thinking about this. And the one thing that led them to the separations of power is Jeremiah 17:9, which is a verse in the Bible, and it states, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" And so they understood this. And if you're not making the connection between how does that relate to separation of powers and men being wicked, well, if you just look throughout history, something that I've talked about frequently in my episodes, when you have centralized power, what is going to happen is eventually you will get somebody who just abuses their power. You may have that benevolent monarch for an extended period of time, but sooner or later their reign will end. And who's to know if the next person stepping in to fulfill that role will be as benevolent? More than likely they will not. How can I make this assumption? Well, history shows us this. And also, just with human nature being naturally inclined to disobey the natural order and to believe we are gods, and the best judgment call comes from a human rather than a higher being. So we tend to eliminate and battle against God in every way possible, which we see definitely in today's society. And so the framers understood this very well, and they wanted to make sure that they could do everything they could to contain the wickedness of man in government by ensuring they could mitigate as much as possible the evil nature in men. And this is even why John Adams, who said, he said the following: "We have no government armed with power capable of containing human passions unbridled by mortality and religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." And this is exactly right. If you cannot see this, then I would say that unfortunately you have been blinded by the society we are putting up on a pedestal today, which is saying that we have all these freedoms when we really don't have freedoms. We're becoming slaves to our passions. And the reason we're becoming slaves to our passions is because we are unable to self-govern. And the luminaries are saying, hey, do whatever you want to do. You want to have sex with a bunch of people? Do so. You have these contraceptions. You want to commit sodomy? Do so. It doesn't matter anymore. You want to idolize people? Do so. You want to do a whole swarm of things that one shouldn't do if you really wanted to be in control of your life, which is what freedom is. Then what happens is you create a group of people that are wholeheartedly dependent on somebody telling them what to do because they cannot get out of their own world. They become self-absorbed and self-centered, and then you develop this narcissistic society which we live in now. And I fully believe that part of the reason we are entering this narcissistic age is due to our smartphones. And I am not trying to belittle anyone when I'm talking about smartphones and social media. I use them frequently. I understand I have a problem. My wife and I talk about this issue that we both have. We spend too much of our free time on our phones. We do try to reduce our usage and be more conscious of when we're using our phones. It is still difficult to divorce yourselves completely for a whole day from your phone just due to the dependency that we are all building the dependency that is being created rather to the devices we have in our pockets that allow us to do so many things, and a lot of these things are not good. And one of the things that sticks out to my mind like a sore thumb is pornography. Pornography is used to is a weapon. It truly is. If you look back at Israel, they actually used pornography on Palestine to try to make the men docile and just become slaves to their passions, which is what's happening in America and most of the Western world. And you see this in Iran today. The West is actively using pornography to try and enslave the people of Iran, and they're doing it under the guise of freedom. By watching porn as having freedom, when in reality it is not. This is an old ancient trick that was used way back in the day, where they would have these naked women, or at least half-naked women, perform, and typically the only men who were able to go into those areas were wealthy men. And then what happened is it became more pervasive with media, and even more pervasive with social media. The encouraging thing, what happened for about a 32-year reign from the 30s until the 1965, was when the Catholic Church stepped up and said, hey, we don't want any nudity, we don't want any blasphemy, we don't want any of this stuff inside of movies. And so they helped redirect the course of Hollywood. And I just found out today that in 1929, Hollywood was actually going bankrupt due to the fact that they were purchasing this new technology which would allow them to capture audio, and so they were trying to find ways to generate revenue, and one of the ways that they were trying to generate revenue was trying to sexualize things. And then as we see in the 60s, well, the sexual revolution completely overturned all American principles and started to invert our society, and now we are completely at a loss. We are at an all-time low when it comes to meaningness. We're at an all-time high when it comes to depression. Most people don't want to start a family. Most people don't want to get married. And all we see is our people, rather, trying to just hook up with somebody else and thinking they can find love through multiple partners and fulfillment through multiple partners and through money and material items, when in reality that isn't the case. There is a movement in my generation and in millennials. See, I'm a little confused when it comes to that differentiation between Gen Z and millennials, well, that breaking point rather, and because I see some places saying 1995 is the ending of millennials, and I see some places saying the generation after that, I believe Gen I or Gen Z, I believe it's Gen I, saying that they begin at 1995. So I'm not too sure. Either way, the two generations are pretty much intermingled in that they are they are facing a lot of meaningless and depression in their life. And unfortunately, though, the latter generation, the Gen I and Gen Zs, are actually fighting back, and they're seeing that, okay, what was being told to millennials obviously isn't working, and so they're trying to do the opposite. And like we've talked about before on the show, the opposite way to go in today's society is to get married, believe in God, have a family, and provide, and not be a slave to your devices. And where I was getting at, I just remembered because I kind of lost my train of thought there. But what I was getting at is we see the millennials as well as the new generations coming up that they are becoming more minimalistic in that they are divorcing themselves from material items, and you see them wanting to have experiences more than money. They don't really care about working hard, although they want to make a lot of money, but you can't separate working hard and making a lot of money. The two commingle. You can't separate the two. And if you try to, well, the only way you can not work hard and make a lot of money is if you inherit a lot of money or you win the lottery, something that is very unlikely for most people to ever happen to, which is inheritance and winning the lottery. So really, we need to get back to the basics and realize that our nation, whether you like it or not, whether you're irreligious, it doesn't matter. The morals our nation was built upon was Christianity. And this whole Judeo-Christian thing, I don't know if I buy it anymore. It just doesn't make sense to me when you think about it, because the Judeo faith doesn't believe in Jesus being the Messiah. And in Christianity, that is the center point of the religion, Jesus being the Messiah. So how can you have the two create the foundation for our society? It just doesn't make sense. You can make the argument, well, Judaism is focused on the Old Testament, and Christianity has both the Old and New Testament. But how can you have the two exist within each other, coexist, when one doesn't accept the Old, one doesn't accept the New Testament, and the other does? Because the whole foundation of Christianity is about the resurrection of Jesus, which is, we know with 100% certainty now that it is true that Jesus Christ was a real person and that he rose from the dead. You have 500 witnesses. And if that isn't enough for you to come to the conclusion that the resurrection was real, hear this. Paul Meyer, who is a theologian at Western Michigan, and he teaches theology, religion, and maybe even philosophy too, if I'm not mistaken. But I could be wrong in the latter part. Anyway, I was watching a lecture, and in the lecture it referenced to Paul Meyer. And if I'm not mistaken, Paul Meyer said that in most ancient history texts, in order to really confirm an event happened, is if you have one independent source. One independent source. For those of you who are into history or history majors or history buffs, one independent source wouldn't really be sufficient in the modern history, if you will. But in ancient history, it was accepted because it's really hard to come by a lot of corroborating evidence to back up a story. So if you have one independent source, it is usually deemed good. If you have two or three, it's deemed impeccable. It did happen. It's a fact. Well, Jesus' resurrection has 11 independent sources saying that it is true, yet we deny it. And this denial, this continuous rebellion, is just in our nature to do so, which is why we are where we are, supporting late-term abortions, thinking it's okay to kill babies, and losing our aspect of sovereignty and wanting to say everybody is equal when that really isn't the case. As far as people being equal and how they should be treated, I don't even think that's true, because people act horribly. They do. A lot of people act horribly, and I'm not judging. I act horribly in a lot of ways. I know I have a lot of flaws. This is just an objective observation. So by no means am I judging anybody here, because I understand I am not perfect. I am wrong in so many ways. I have done evil, probably in a lot of ways. And as of you, we are all this. This is who we are as fallen beings. So the point I'm getting at is we have a bunch of people who are running around thinking that they're doing good when really they're not doing good. Because by nature we don't do good. And if you divorce yourself from religion, what is your morals for good? How do you have that standard? You can't have a standard without some universal acceptance. And the universal acceptance for such a long time was Christianity in America. If I remember the statistic correctly, this was in Auburn University. They did a report on this, and also the Nebraska State Senate did a report on this. 98.6% of the people in America during the time of the founding were Christians. They were Christians. And the way they were able to live so freely was because they held themselves in high regards. They had a moral standard to live by. And now we're saying there is no such thing as a natural order. You create your natural order. It is only true to you, which is this idea of postmodernism that originates way back in the day with critical theory. And you intertwine that with, well, critical theory and cultural Marxism is the same thing. But what they realized, the people who created the Frankfurt School, which created the cultural Marxism, is that Marx was only partially right, in their opinion. They said he was only partially right when it came to the economics. What he missed out on was the cultural aspect, and that's the way to bring down the West. Not by the economy, but by the cultural aspect, which is what we see now. We're in cultural warfare. We have all of our standards being tipped upside down, saying, like Don Lemon on CNN, saying, we need to really stop demonizing people and realize that white men are the biggest terror threat to America. Come on. Did you not just catch that hypocrisy that came out of his mouth? I mean, that was all over CNN. Nobody wants to talk about it. And these things are just clear as day. They're just clear as day. And there's another thing that I want to bring up, and that is, I recently saw this article. My uncle referred it to me, and he posted it as well. And, it basically said Donald Trump isn't a Christian, which, who knows? Who knows? Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. I'm not the person to judge that. I know that the things that he has done throughout his life, most could say are not Christian. But then again, who are we to judge? Because we don't deserve to be saved. We don't. The only reason we're deserved to be saved is through grace, through faith, through love of God. Anyway, so not defending him, but just making a point that I don't know who could judge if you're a real Christian or not. We can have opinions on that, but I don't know. I don't think it's really my place to say who's a real Christian or not. Anyway, the point of the president is to be the mouthpiece for the culture and the centerpiece for the culture. So they aren't really, they're governing in the sense of influencing the society into a direction. They're the shepherd to the sheep. Think of it like that. And I think Donald Trump has done a really good job at guiding America to regain its positive ideal of who we are and what America is. And if he is lying about his Christian faith to instill that Christian belief in people again, I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. One shouldn't lie. Lying's a sin. I understand that. But once again, if he's not lying, that's awesome. I can't say whether he's lying or not. I don't know the man personally. But what I do know is that he is leading the country in the right direction. If you disagree, there are multiple studies that just recently came out that are showing, for one, America has become less racist under his presidency than under Obama's presidency, which is kind of ironic considering Barack Obama was a black president, and you would assume having a black president would then signify our nation becoming less racist. Actually, hate crimes and racism rose under Obama due to his usage of the bully pulpit, and Donald Trump's usage of the bully pulpit has done the opposite. It has decreased, reduced the racism in our country, and it has a lot to do with the fact that the unemployment rate in the minority communities are at an all-time low for Hispanics and blacks. And you also see another thing that President Trump is doing that for some reason we are criticizing, when I don't really understand why we're criticizing. It is a good thing, which are the trade wars. I know that people are affected by it as far as companies go. My wife's company is affected by the trade wars. My dad has said that they've been affected by the trade wars. The thing is, during the first bit of the trade war, before we had this stalemate period where they tried to come up with a deal and the deal didn't really come through, and now we're back in. I mean, he imposed more tariffs. Before that, we had a growth of manufacturing jobs when it was just the tariffs on steel and aluminum and a few other things. Now we've reimpose the tariffs, and it is expected to actually generate 750,000 jobs in America. That is incredible, and the reason they will generate so many jobs is due to the fact that, one, we'll be bringing in more revenue, which I don't really know if plays into the role, but as a country, we'll be bringing in more revenue, we'll be wealthier, and the logistics and, mainly the logistics of it will make it more convenient for companies to do business here than overseas. And it'll also be cheaper because they wouldn't have the tariffs since they have business in China. So it'll be cheaper and it'll be wiser, logistically speaking, for companies to move back here if the tariffs are in place, which will then generate almost 1 million jobs just due to that alone, which is incredible, and nobody wants to talk about that. So those are really, really good things that are happening right now. Obviously, there are a lot of bad things, and we have a long way to go. I do believe that our culture is making a slow turn and opening up our eyes. I don't know if we will necessarily be able to reinvigorate what we had before, but we are definitely heading in the right direction. There will need to be some sort of conflict in order for things to go back the way they were. I'm not encouraging that conflict. I'm not saying start some conflict so that way we can go back to the way things were. All I'm saying is that from an objective standpoint, it seems essential for that to take place. Without that taking place, we're just going to keep going down the same path. We won't change. And the reason it needs to take, and the reason it will, it's almost inevitable, is because when you have a culture that is so divided, you can't even stand together. There's bound to be insurrection going on. It's just bound to be. So that's just something to think about. And to get back to the idea in which I was talking about earlier that started this thing about the separation of powers and learning more about that, the big thing that I really wanted to focus on was the whole Trinity aspect. Because if you think about it, it sort of makes sense that the founders would be inspired by that analogy to implement a chain of command, if you will. Because you have the judicial branch, you have the executive branch, and you have the legislative branch. One may think that the executive branch would be the one for judgment, etc. The figurehead for God, if you will. Although you can't resemble God on earth. I don't think you can do that because it's incomprehensible. But the point is that it's supposed to model something similar to govern us in a way that we are truly free. And so you would find the judicial branch being the one for justice. I think we can all figure out who the justice is supposed to be, the one who does the judgment. Then you have the legislative branch that's supposed to represent the people, help guide the people, persuade the people into thinking better ideas or bad ideas if you have a malevolent body in Congress, which I think for the most part we do right now. Anyway, so you have the legislative branch for the people. Then you have the executive branch, and I've just talked about the executive branch and what the executive branch's job is to do, which is to guide, to inspire, to lead, which I think all three of those examples you can draw your own conclusions to figure out how they are analogous to the Trinity in a way individually. So these are just some of my ideas as far as that goes. I could be wrong. I do think it's right, but I could be wrong. And if you have different opinions on that, I would love to hear your opinions on it, to tell me why I'm wrong, or if I'm right, why you agree with me, or if you just agree with me, whatever. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we really need to come to an understanding as a nation that our existence as a sovereign nation is truly dependent on religion itself. And one may say, what about separation of church and state? If you haven't watched my last episode on the meaning of separation of church and state, I implore you to do so. The answer's there. But to give you the short answer, the reason why we have separation of church and state is so that the federal government does not establish a ruling religion. To have an institution That's poorly phrased. Rather, to make sure the federal government doesn't have a national church leading the way. Rather, religion needs to guide us individually rather than having a monolithic understanding of what one should and shouldn't do, having it come from a centralized power. Rather, disperse it individually and hold yourself to those moral standards within the good book. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. I hope you guys enjoyed the episode, and be sure to subscribe and also follow on Instagram at A Better World, and also on Facebook, A Better World, and my personal account is Luis Acevedo. And yeah, so we will be back sometime this week. All right, peace.